Grant Wilson built Ghost Hunters into the most credible paranormal investigation franchise in television history. 14 seasons, hundreds of cases, a methodology whose rigor separated the show from everything the paranormal television genre had produced before it. And across all of it, across every case, every piece of evidence, every editorial decision the network made about what the audience was permitted to see, Grant Wilson stayed quiet. Until 1 minute ago. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what he just exposed changes everything. Grant Wilson's position in the paranormal television landscape is unique in a way that is easy to understate and important to establish precisely before engaging with what his exposure contains. He did not arrive in the paranormal television space as a presenter looking for a platform. He arrived as a working investigator, a member of the Atlantic Paranormal Society, whose field methodology and evidentiary standards had been developed across years of private investigation before any camera crew was involved, whose transition into television production was built entirely on the foundation of an existing investigative practice rather than on the requirements of a television format. That distinction is the source of the credibility his exposure carries. Ghost Hunters was not a show about Grant Wilson investigating the paranormal. It was a show about the Atlantic Paranormal Society's investigation methodology being documented by a television production, a fundamentally different proposition whose implications for how the evidence was collected, evaluated, and presented distinguished the franchise from every comparable paranormal television production in the genre's history. The TAPS methodology, the systematic approach to environmental baseline documentation, the rigorous application of conventional explanation before entertaining unconventional ones, the commitment to debunking that Ronnie Holland's role in Expedition Bigfoot would later replicate in a different production context, gave the Ghost Hunters investigation record an evidentiary quality that the paranormal television genre had not previously achieved. Grant Wilson was the methodological anchor of that quality. His professional background as an electrical engineer gave the show's technical investigation framework a credibility that most paranormal television productions cannot claim. His instinct for conventional explanation, his genuine preference for identifying a non-paranormal source for anomalous evidence before entertaining paranormal interpretation, gave the show's positive findings a weight that the audience recognized as meaningful precisely because it came from someone whose default was skepticism rather than belief. He left Ghost Hunters. The official account of his departure describes a personal decision to step back from the demands of 14 seasons of television production to focus on family and other professional interests. What he just exposed suggests the official account was incomplete, and the specific nature of its incompleteness is what the rest of this video addresses. The relationship between the Atlantic Paranormal Society's investigation operation and the Syfy network that broadcast Ghost Hunters was never as straightforward as the franchise's public presentation suggested. From the earliest seasons of the show's run, the fundamental tension between what TAPS was doing as an investigation organization and what Syfy needed as a commercial television property was present in the production in ways that the people closest to the show's development have described in partial accounts across the years since the franchise's original run concluded. TAPS arrived at the television relationship with a methodology and an evidentiary standard whose requirements were not always compatible with the production demands of a cable television series whose commercial success depended on delivering dramatic content to a specific audience on a specific schedule. The investigation methodology demanded what it demanded regardless of what the production schedule required. A location either produced evidence within the time frame of the investigation deployment or it did not, and the evidence either met the TAPS evidentiary standard or it did not. The production schedule required deliverable content regardless of what the investigation produced, and the network's audience expectations required dramatic content rather than the methodologically rigorous but often undramatic process of systematic conventional explanation elimination that the TAPS approach produced most of the time. The management of that tension across 14 seasons of the franchise's run is what produced the editorial relationship between the TAPS investigation record and the Ghost Hunters broadcast record. The gap between what the investigation documented and what the network permitted the audience to see. Grant Wilson's position in that relationship was the most complex of any person involved in the production. He was simultaneously the investigation's methodological anchor, the person whose standards determined what the TAPS operation accepted as genuine evidence, and the production's primary on-screen presence, whose commercial value to the franchise made his relationship with the network a constant negotiation between the investigation's evidentiary requirements and the production's entertainment requirements. What he is exposing is the specific history of what that negotiation produced, what the network hid from the audience across the franchise's run, what evidence was managed out of the broadcast record, and what the investigation produced that the network determined the audience could not be shown. That history is more extensive than anyone outside the production has previously had access to, and Wilson has decided the time for access has arrived. What Grant Wilson's exposure establishes about the Ghost Hunters' evidence management history is not a general claim that Syfy edited the show in ways that misrepresented the investigation. It is a specific account of identifiable categories of evidence that the network's editorial process consistently removed from the broadcast record across multiple seasons, regardless of which specific investigation produced them. A pattern of suppression whose consistency across independent cases and independent seasons indicates a policy rather than a series of independent editorial decisions. The first category is what Wilson describes as the interactive class of evidence, instances in which the investigation's active engagement with the phenomenon present at a location produced responses whose character indicated intelligence rather than residual energy. The Ghost Hunters methodology distinguished carefully between residual haunting activity, the replay of recorded energy that produces consistent, non-interactive phenomenon, and intelligent haunting activity, in which the phenomenon responds to the investigation's direct engagement in ways that indicate awareness. The broadcast record of Ghost Hunters contains examples of both categories. What Wilson's exposure establishes is that the broadcast record's representation of the intelligent interaction category is substantially incomplete, that across multiple seasons of investigation, instances of direct intelligent interaction between the TAPS investigation team and the phenomenon present at specific locations were documented in the raw investigation footage and then removed from the broadcast episodes before they reached the audience. The specific nature of what those removed interactions contained, the character of the responses the investigation elicited, the specific form those responses took, and what the investigation team's assessment of their significance produced in the evidentiary record, is the content of the exposure's most detailed section. The second category is the physical evidence category, instances in which the investigation documented physical effects on team members or physical changes in the investigation environment that the conventional explanation-elimination process failed to account for. The broadcast record contains examples of this category as well. Wilson's exposure establishes that the broadcast examples are a fraction of the documented instances, that across the franchise's run, the production compiled a record of physical evidence events whose cumulative significance the network's editorial process determined could not be represented in its complete form without producing a broadcast record, whose implications for the audience's understanding of what Ghost Hunters was actually finding exceeded what the network was willing to put in front of them. The specific investigations that Grant Wilson identifies in his exposure as the cases whose complete records represent the most significant gap between the Ghost Hunters' broadcast history and the investigation's actual findings are not the investigations the Ghost Hunters audience would necessarily predict on the basis of the broadcast episode's most dramatic moments. They are not the cases whose broadcast versions were the most extreme or the most evidentially compelling. They are the cases whose broadcast versions were the most edited. The investigations where the distance between what the investigation produced and what the audience was shown was greatest, and where that distance was produced not by the ordinary compression of a full investigation into a broadcast episode, but by the systematic removal of specific categories of evidence whose presence in the complete record would have changed the audience's understanding of what Ghost Hunters was finding. Wilson describes several specific investigations in his exposure with a level of detail that the broadcast record alone would not permit. Detail that reflects his direct knowledge of what the investigation produced rather than his recollection of what the broadcast version presented. The cases he describes are distributed across the franchise's 14-season run rather than concentrated in any specific period, indicating that the evidence management pattern he is exposing was consistent across the franchise's history, rather than specific to any particular production period or network executive relationship. One case he describes in particular detail involved a location whose investigation produced physical evidence of a class that the TAPS methodology had rarely encountered in its prior battlefield history, evidence that the complete investigation record documented extensively, and that the broadcast version of the episode reduced to a brief reference whose vagueness was not the result of evidentiary ambiguity, but of deliberate editorial decision. The complete record of that investigation is what Wilson describes in the most specific terms of any case in the exposure: what the investigation found, what the evidence consisted of, what the TAPS team's assessment of the evidence produced, and why the network's decision to remove the majority of that evidence from the broadcast version of the episode was made with a speed that indicated institutional certainty rather than editorial deliberation. Grant Wilson's departure from Ghost Hunters after the show's 7th season was addressed publicly at the time through communications that described a personal decision made for personal reasons, the demands of 14 seasons of television production, the desire to spend more time with his family, and the interest in pursuing other professional projects that the sustained commitment to Ghost Hunters had not permitted. Those reasons are real. They are not complete. What Wilson's exposure addresses about the departure is the specific professional context that existed at the point he made the decision to leave, the state of the relationship between the TAPS investigation operation and the Syfy network at that particular moment in the franchise's history, and what that relationship had produced in the period immediately preceding the departure that made the personal reasons for leaving also function as professional ones. The specific incident that Wilson describes in the exposure as the proximate context for the departure decision is connected to an investigation whose complete record represents one of the cases whose specific detail he addresses in the exposure's most significant section. The investigation produced evidence that Wilson assessed as the most significant the TAPS operation had ever documented. Evidence whose character and whose implications he describes in terms that reflect his professional assessment rather than dramatic emphasis, because his professional assessment is the most credible basis for characterizing what the investigation found. The network's response to that evidence, its editorial decision about how the complete investigation record would be represented in the broadcast version of the episode, made after Wilson had communicated his assessment of the evidence's significance, produced in Wilson the specific professional reckoning that the personal reasons for departure were already creating the conditions for. The departure was not caused by the network's decision about that investigation's evidence, but the decision confirmed something about the nature of the editorial relationship between the investigation and the network that the prior season's accumulated friction had been pointing toward without producing the clarity that this specific decision produced. What the decision confirmed, what the network's response to the most significant evidence the TAPS operation had ever produced established about the fundamental character of its relationship to the investigation's findings, is what Wilson describes in the exposure as the professional dimension of the departure that the official account did not address. The evidence whose existence Grant Wilson's exposure establishes, and whose content his account describes for the first time, is distributed across the Ghost Hunters investigation record in a way that reflects the pattern of suppression the prior section of this video established, present across multiple seasons, across multiple case types, and across multiple evidence categories in a manner consistent with a systematic editorial policy rather than a series of independent content decisions. What the hidden evidence contains, in the specific terms that Wilson's exposure provides, falls into three primary categories whose combined significance is what makes the exposure's impact on the Ghost Hunters record more than the sum of its individual parts. The first is video documentation of direct intelligent interaction between the TAPS investigation team and the phenomenon present at specific locations, footage whose content demonstrates responsive, awareness-indicating behavior from the phenomenon that the broadcast versions of the relevant episodes referenced indirectly without showing. Wilson describes specific instances of this documentation in terms that establish both the evidential quality of the footage and the specific character of the interactions it records, what the investigation team did, what the phenomenon responded with, and what the TAPS methodology's assessment of that response produced in terms of the evidentiary classification of the interaction. The second category is audio evidence, recordings whose frequency analysis and whose structural characteristics the investigation's acoustic analysis produced findings about that the broadcast episodes either did not address or addressed in substantially edited form. Wilson describes specific recordings from specific investigations whose acoustic analysis produced findings that the TAPS methodology assessed as falling outside the range of conventional explanation and whose broadcast treatment did not represent the full findings of that acoustic analysis. The third category is the physical evidence documentation, the medical records, the environmental measurements, and the physical trace evidence documentation that the TAPS investigation compiled across the cases whose complete records Wilson's exposure addresses. This category is the one whose existence the broadcast record most substantially misrepresents, not through fabrication but through omission, through the systematic removal of physical evidence documentation whose cumulative significance across the investigation's complete record would have established something about what Ghost Hunters was finding that the broadcast record's selective representation of the physical evidence category was specifically designed not to establish. The question of what Syfy knew about the Ghost Hunters investigation record, what the network's own review of the raw footage produced in terms of its understanding of what the TAPS investigation was actually finding, is the question that Grant Wilson's exposure addresses with the most evident weight. Because the network's editorial decisions about the Ghost Hunters evidence are only interpretable as a policy rather than a series of independent content judgments. If the network possessed a comprehensive understanding of what the investigation was producing, that its editorial decisions were responding to, if the people making the decisions about what the audience was permitted to see understood the complete record they were managing. What Wilson's exposure establishes is that they did. The network's review process for Ghost Hunters' raw footage gave the production executives and standards personnel who participated in it access to the full investigation record, every piece of evidence the TAPS team documented, every instrument reading, every audio recording, every video segment, before any editorial decision was made about what the broadcast version of any episode would contain. The review process was thorough by the standards of cable television production, and its thoroughness meant that the people making the editorial decisions had seen what the investigation found before they decided what the audience would be shown. What Wilson's exposure establishes about what those reviews produced in the people who conducted them is the most significant element of this section, because what the network executives who reviewed the complete Ghost Hunters investigation record knew about what the show was finding is the context within which their editorial decisions must be understood. They were not managing the broadcast record of an investigation whose findings they had limited knowledge of. They were managing the broadcast record of an investigation whose findings they had comprehensive knowledge of, and whose comprehensive findings they had determined the audience could not be shown in their complete form. The specific nature of that determination, what the network concluded about the complete findings, and why that conclusion produced the editorial policy that Wilson's exposure documents, is the element of what the network was hiding that Wilson describes as the most significant, not the suppressed evidence itself. The institutional decision about what to do with it, and what that decision communicates about what the institution understood the evidence to mean. Ghost Hunters ran for 14 seasons and produced a broadcast record that the paranormal television genre has not matched in the credibility of its investigative methodology or the duration of its sustained documentation of anomalous phenomenon across a consistent evidentiary standard. That record exists now in the context that Grant Wilson's exposure establishes as the portion of the complete Ghost Hunters investigation record that the Syfy network determined the audience could be shown. The exposure does not diminish the broadcast record. The findings the broadcast episodes document are real findings whose evidential quality the TAPS methodology's rigor established across 14 seasons of systematic investigation. What the exposure does is establish the broadcast record's relationship to the complete record, the ratio between what the investigation found and what the audience was shown, in a way that the broadcast record alone could not establish, and that the Ghost Hunters community has been sensing without having confirmed across the years since the franchise's original run concluded. The Ghost Hunters audience that engaged most seriously with the franchise, that watched the methodology rather than the drama, that tracked the evidence across seasons rather than responding to individual episodes' most extreme moments, has been operating with an incomplete picture of what the investigation produced. The exposure completes the picture. Not fully. Wilson's account of the hidden evidence is a disclosure rather than a complete release, a description of what exists rather than the evidence itself, but sufficiently to establish the character of what the complete picture contains and what its existence means for the broadcast record standing as a representation of the investigation's findings. What it means for the Ghost Hunters legacy specifically is that the franchise's most significant contribution to the paranormal investigation record is not the broadcast episodes. It is the complete investigation archive, the full body of evidence the TAPS methodology produced across 14 seasons of systematic fieldwork, whose existence the broadcast record has always implied and whose character Wilson's exposure has now described. The legacy is larger than what aired. significantly larger, and the portion that did not air contains the findings that the broadcast record was always building toward without being permitted to fully arrive at. Grant Wilson built Ghost Hunters on a simple and radical proposition: that paranormal investigation deserved to be conducted with the same methodological rigor that any other empirical inquiry demands, and that the results of rigorous investigation deserved to be presented to the audience honestly, regardless of what those results were. That proposition was the foundation of everything the franchise achieved, and everything it meant to the audience that followed it. The exposure he just delivered is the most direct expression of that proposition in the franchise's history. The act of a man whose foundational commitment was to honest representation of what the investigation found, deciding that the honest representation was not what the broadcast record had provided, and that the gap between the proposition and its execution deserved to be addressed publicly. What the exposure changes is not primarily about Ghost Hunters. It is about what Ghost Hunters represents in the broader context of paranormal investigation documentation and institutional management of anomalous evidence. A franchise whose investigation methodology was the most credible the paranormal television genre had produced, whose evidentiary standards were designed by people whose professional backgrounds gave them the framework to apply genuine rigor to the investigation of phenomenon that conventional institutions declined to engage with, produced findings across 14 seasons that the network whose commercial relationship gave it editorial control over the broadcast record systematically managed out of the public domain. That management is the institutional pattern whose most documented example the Ghost Hunters suppressed evidence record represents. The same pattern, credible investigation producing significant findings, institutional framework managing those findings out of public view, is present in the NIDS research, in the AAWSAP program, in the editorial histories of every paranormal documentary franchise whose investigation has gotten close enough to something real that the institutional response to its findings has been management rather than disclosure. Grant Wilson just exposed his franchise's version of that pattern. The exposure is specific, documented, and delivered by the person whose credibility in this domain is the most defensible available. What it changes is the audience's ability to continue treating the Ghost Hunters broadcast record as a complete representation of what the investigation found. It was not. Grant Wilson just made that impossible to pretend otherwise. And what the complete record contains, what 14 seasons of rigorous TAPS investigation documented that the Syfy network determined the audience could never see, is now a question that the exposure has established cannot be answered by the broadcast record alone. The archive exists, the evidence is in it, and Grant Wilson has now told the world it is there.